I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. At a Senate Banking Committee hearing on Tuesday, Senator Kevin Cramer discussed the housing market. The North Dakota senator condemned onerous regulations and claimed they were partially responsible for the rising price of rents. Senator Cramer said another problem was the government doesn't do enough to incentivize supply. Listen in for more.
Understand Senator Cramer is next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. Thanks to all of our witnesses for being here. Mr. Dunn, I think we all, it seems that we pretty much can all agree to some degree on the problem. I will tell you, in listening to Senator Toomey's questioning, my mind started going down the usual path of what is the ultimate end to the constant government distortion of markets, the sticks and the carrots that seem to just create a higher price and very little in regards to providing more supply. I mean, the biggest problem with inflation, the cause of inflation, is when demand outpaces supply. So we keep incenting demand and don't do enough, in my view, to incentivize supply. And I'm not really sure where it all ends. But one part of that scenario that we don't talk about enough is the cost of regulation. And there's been a study I'm sure you're familiar with recently that predicts about 40% of the cost of multifamily and single-family rent is regulation. Can you speak a little bit to government regulation? And again, I am sincere when I say I think we struggle to find the balance. Every time we try to solve a problem, we incentivize one side or the other, and all we do is escalate costs. Can you speak a little bit to that imbalance and what's the right balance, if you have a sense of what that might be?
Yes, Senator Cramer, and you're correct. The National Home Builders Association, they did do a study, and looking at all levels of government, regulation adds about 40% to the cost of building homes and to the cost of building real estate and developing real estate, and that is directly passed on to the very people we're trying to help. So we have to make sure that we're dealing with the root cause of the issue, which is a lack of supply. And everyone, even every witness here today, we agree that that is the problem. Mm-hmm. And we need to focus our efforts and focus our dollars on every level of government, local, state, and federal level, on making sure we're creating more housing. And when we create solutions that, in many cases, I even understand why they're being created in the short term to help one side, it doesn't help the problem, and it doesn't solve the problem that we need more housing. We have to make sure there's plans that create more units and not initiatives that pit one side against the other. We have to make sure that tenant-landlord bond, which is sacred, is, has a place to live in this country.
Sure. And you don't advocate, I don't think any of us advocate no regulations. Obviously, there needs to be protections put in place. But I agree. Honestly, the problem is easier to identify than the solution. I readily admit. I mean, when the incentives create a distortion to the point where the cost of rent is going up faster than the rest of the economy, that's not the right solution. But I'm kind of with you. I'd like to see us focus more on the supply side, but I'm not sure that completely does it either, because sometimes you can end up with just an overabundance of that as well. But anyway, with that, thank you all for. And by the way, I mean, I still have a minute and a half. If anybody else wants to comment on the same question, either from a different perspective, I'd be happy to listen.
Well, I'd be happy to share that related to regulations or state and local laws, that one of the biggest challenges to increasing affordable housing supply is often restrictive local zoning that inhibits the supply of any kind of apartments, and especially affordable apartments. Mm-hmm. And this drives up costs for everybody, and it exacerbates segregation and other racial disparities. So states and localities will need to do more to limit or entirely remove those restrictive zoning laws if we're to be able to build the number of homes that the country needs. And the federal government can use the levers that it has, primarily in creating incentives or requirements that are tied to federal funding, especially the big pots of funding through the transportation the bipartisan transportation infrastructure bill. That can create a very compelling incentive for local communities if they are able to receive those funds only if they do more at the local level to reduce restrictive zoning.
The only thing that concerns me about that is that that sounds swell until the local community decides it's not worth the funding, in which case you've solved no problem.
Well, that's why we should think bigger than the housing funds, where typically we do look at incentives for restrictive zoning, and we should look to the much bigger pots of money that all communities want related to transportation funds, highways, et cetera.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.